Good morning, everyone. The webinar will begin in about 5 minutes. While waiting, I do encourage you to download the handouts that are available under the Handouts tab on the control panel on the right side of your screen. There are two there. One will summarize the presentation today, and the other one is a template that Alberto will be going over here partway through the presentation. So I encourage you to download those and have those handy for you during the presentation today. While we wait for the webinar to begin, we do have Alberto Arroyo online. Alberto, with the nature of business drastically changing recently, where are you seeing organizations using assessments more often? I also welcome those of you on the line to submit your answers on how your organizations are using the assessments through the chat function on the control panels on the right side of your screen. Alberto, where are you seeing assessments being used more often these days?
Well, Patrick, thank you for the question. And I think I would begin by grouping the categories into two larger ones. One would be selection, and the other would be development. And I think when I started my in organizational development work, I think the majority of the assessment work was around the selection piece. Organizations wanted to pick the right people for the right role, and as a result, there was often a battery of assessments and tests provided and given in order to help make that person's job fit. But as I've progressed in my career, I think I've seen more and more of the percentage of the leveraging of assessments being in the space of development. Once a leader, once an employee, once a team together within an organization, how do we leverage assessments in order to sort of expedite the relationship building, help motivate, help resolve conflict, really help identify what type of key roles each individual could make based on natural strengths and abilities that an individual may bring to the organization. So specifically speaking around the development piece, organizations are investing more and more into coaching / mentoring, a little bit more on the coaching side than the mentoring side. And many times the mentor, the coachee and the coach do not know each other. And as a result, the coach would likely leverage several assessments in order to get to know and understand and sort of expedite the relationship building, the competency understanding, as well as the trust within the relationship, as oftentimes this information is confidential, as it helps build the relationship moving forward. And the other piece that really comes to mind around the development part is assimilations of leader and or new teams that are formed for an intense project. I'm seeing the latter even more and more. So an organization, many of which are very global, or at least depend on cross-functional collaboration. There's an intense short-term, high visibility project where you have multiple team members from different areas, different functions, different perspectives coming together in order to build a team to accomplish the goal. And oftentimes assessments will be used in order to help team members get to know each other, as well as understand what might be best job role fits. So the use of understanding each other becomes very valuable in getting a team off and running pretty quickly.
Okay, great. Okay, so we are just about at time. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Leveraging Individual Assessments to Build Organizational Culture. Since we want to continue to deliver these informational webinars for you and also practice social distancing, we are delivering this webinar remotely. Your facilitator, Alberto Arroyo, will be presenting from his office and me from mine. My name is Patrick Allen. I'm the program manager for Kent State University Center for Corporate and Professional Development, Public Open Enrollment Programs. Our center specializes in providing employee development for partnering organizations in Northeast Ohio and around the country. We offer training as both public open enrollment programs, currently being delivered live and virtually via Zoom, and we also offer customized programs delivered live and virtual at your location or at your location. I'm joined today by Kent State Facilitator Alberto Arroyo. I will be serving as your host, and Alberto will be our presenter for today. For over 15 years, Alberto has facilitated leaders across various sectors, including higher education, retail, parishes, consultative services, and healthcare. He has partnered with a wide variety of organizations to advance the development of their leaders, including university hospitals, Southern Adventist University, General Electric, and Hewlett-Packard. Alberto believes that the best workplace outcomes occur when science and art, logic and intuition, and mind and heart are proportionally applied. He is certified in and uses a multitude of assessments to help him tailor leadership solutions to address the challenges and problems of each organization. He received a Master of Arts in Industrial and Organizational Psychology and also an MBA from Elmhurst College. Everyone in attendance today has been muted to avoid background noise from any of the over 100 registered participants. We do encourage you to ask questions at any point during the hour. You can submit your questions in writing using the control panel on the right side of your screen. I will present your questions to Alberto as time permits throughout the webinar. There are a couple of handouts available to you that summarizes today's presentation. They are located under the Handouts tab on the control panel. We encourage you to download them and take notes during today's presentation. We are recording today's webinar, and you will receive an email next week with a link to the recording after we conclude our time together. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you, the participants, if your organization is currently using any assessments in any fashion. Please select the best answer now, and then I will show the results. Okay, just a few more seconds. It looks like pretty much everybody has voted. So Alberta, it looks like it's a 50-50 split. So we have organizations that are and aren't using the assessments available today.
Very interesting. And I think as we sort of launch into this and begin our conversation, one sort of guiding principle to think about is how can science really help inform decisions that will impact the organization big picture wise as well as individually. And I think that's one of the values of leveraging individual assessments. So before we get into the details and the nitty gritty of assessments, I just want to paint a little bit of a picture that assessments are best utilized and are most potent and powerful when they are placed properly, when they are strategically included in an overall organizational process. So before we can pick the right assessment, before we can really take advantage of its power, we as an organization need to ask big picture questions around what it is that we would like our organization to become. We tend to spend a lot of time from an organizational standpoint talking about processes and systems and ideas and what is the vision and the goals and the mission. And that is very important and relevant, but at the very core of these responses are people, people that have skills, they have strengths, they have preferences, they have abilities. And individual assessments here pertains on the individual is what we will be spending our time trying to better understand. Because the more we understand the individuals that make up the desired culture, the better we'll be able to find for selection and develop and grow that type of individual. So if you want to go to the next slide, Patrick.
Okay, so now we're going to ask again of the audience, if you are currently using assessments, which assessments do you currently use? And this one will be a multiple choice question, and you can choose any of the ones that are shown on your screen. Okay, just a few more seconds. It looks like, again, most people have voted. So it looks like 63% say other. So I'm curious to see what other ones are out there, but Myers-Briggs, of course, is going to be up there, followed by StrengthsFinder.
Well, if you would do a Google search or just spend any time exploring and looking for assessments, you're going to find hundreds, if not thousands of different approaches for many reasons, including the reality that the person, the individual is so multifaceted, and there are so many different aspects of a person that can be assessed. And there are a lot of people who enjoy assessments, building assessments and applying assessments. So not a surprise that, out of 5 selections, the one other is the most popular one overall. So before jumping into the details of trying to understand an individual, these are just 2 guiding questions that you can perhaps take down as note in a taking stock and setting vision. Before, as I mentioned, assessments could really be applied to benefit the organization. I think the organization has to really understand who we are in an honest and vulnerable type of way, of what we believe in, what types of characteristics and abilities describe the organization, as well as what type of organization we would want to become, that we aspire to be, because what we currently are may not be what we want to continue to be. And this conversation, I think, should involve many more people, than just the, HR professionals. It should include senior leaders, as well as a representative group of leaders and employees throughout the organization. I've seen it done where there's surveys that are shared that, cover all employees, and others that are representative. But the main point here is that we get a good understanding of the reality of what we are from a cultural standpoint as an organization. And I think this could also include asking the customers, the patients, the colleagues, the peers, the industry partners that you also work with, getting an external outside-in perspective could also be beneficial, especially in describing the perception of what culture, what personality the organization has overall. And based on this analysis is when the identification of the right assessments in order to build the right culture could really be beneficial, focusing in on the selection and the development of individuals. So with that being said, let's kind of dive into the individual. So I could have made a ton of bubbles here, but due to space and time, just to give you a little bit of flavor of the different aspects of a person where assessments exist, I highlighted some bubbles here. So consider experience, consider cultural environment and expectations, consider interests, emotional intelligence, individuals' values, their skill sets and abilities that they bring, interpersonal needs, the emotional needs that they have, and personality, all of which are very important and relevant to build understanding of the individual. And I think the major takeaway here is that there's not one silver bullet assessment that will allow you to capture every aspect of who a person is. So as a result, really trying to identify the criteria. What is it that you're trying to understand about that person could help you land and arrive at the most beneficial and useful assessment in order to understand that part of a person. And I think the fun part of leveraging individual assessments is when you have the ability to review multiple assessments and tell a story of an individual. So when you're combining, values outcomes with skills outcomes and interest outcomes, all of a sudden you start to get a bit of a broader and more in-depth understanding of the person, instead of just having one particular aspect and trying to draw a lot of assumptions and conclusions based on an assessment. And I think what might be tricky is that most assessments present themselves as being very agile and flexible and capable of assessing all types of aspects of a person. In reality, the good assessments are those that have a clear criteria of what they're trying to understand about a person. So I think my desire today is to walk you through an example of how to get a broad picture of an individual using a handful of different types of assessments where there's part art and part science involved. So Patrick, you want to move on to the next slide, and we'll spend quite a bit of time on this slide. So what I want to do here is I want to sort of methodically walk through a framework that can be used in order to understand an individual. Understanding that the context is the individual is part of an organization. The individual will be influencing others in the organization and by extension, the culture. So the more that we could understand where an individual might be from a starting standpoint in each of these areas, the better we'll be able to develop training, develop tools, develop language, develop communication, eventually that culture that we're talking about to be exactly what we would like it to be. So let's start from the very top here as we're thinking about an individual. So on the back end of these words, you might notice is an iceberg. And an iceberg has 90% of its body beneath the water. and 10% above the water. I would describe personality and or behaviors as that which is above the water, external, and present for others to see. I would describe it as self-selected because of our desire as individuals to manage and defend and protect that which we want to share to the world. And that's why I describe it as a mask. The longer that you spend with an individual, the less the mask is able to disguise and cover what is beneath the surface. So from a selection standpoint, with so few interactions with a potential candidate, the use and the value of assessments skyrockets because you're able to get beneath their words, beneath their presentation, beneath their resume, to understand a little bit more of who they are, which can make the interview, which can make the selection process a bit more specific as to concerns that you might have, and or to really dive into strengths and characteristics that would be good matches and very productive within your workplace environment. So that's why I would describe this above the water section as what I show the world, behaviors that can and do change. So just consider how in some contexts we're able to demonstrate some skills and some behaviors, actions, and in others we might struggle with or we might decide to present ourselves in different ways. So this is very fluid. How an individual's personality or behaviors might evolve over time. So assessments in this area, I would encourage to be used more than one time. So if someone takes assessments in this space in 2020, it's okay for them to take one in 2023 and 3 years and be able to say that the person has grown and has developed in this particular direction. And we'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that as we get deeper into this model. The actions to exemplify your best self, and then the defense to protect perceived vulnerabilities. So we as human beings are very skilled and very good at being elusive and presenting what we want. It will take a long time for others to really get to the core of who we are, especially the more equipped and skilled we become in presenting our very best self. So therefore, assessments allow us to go sort of behind the curtain, underneath the water more quickly. And we may not know all the details, but at least we have insights because of the assessments of what to ask about. So if someone's personality profile highlights a high strong desire to make decisions, then perhaps you want to explore, well, what's our culture in making decisions? Are we a collaborative environment where lots of input is wanted before moving forward, or are we part of an organization and environment that really wants individuals to be rather self-efficient in making independent decisions without much input or much oversight? You could get some insights on assessments to understand what an individual's propensity to be fast moving, to be independent from a decision making standpoint. Going a layer beneath the surface, I would call values and strengths. So these are learned behaviors, meaning that over time we develop that which might be a foundational value and or strength, and it's therefore nurture influence. So let me give you an example. So think about honesty as a value. An individual who has a high degree of honesty might have a foundation from a temperament, emotional standpoint, that they're people pleasers. Their desire to be approved, appreciated is very high. So as a result, it's harder for them to be elusive. And they share quickly and they share more right away. But perhaps their environment did not discipline them, did not correct them if they would lie or they would exaggerate. So as a result, they got really good at pontificating, at really elaborating, saying a lot, almost, too honest, but perhaps a bit, I don't want to say manipulative because it sounds bad, but they're able to take you where they want you to go because they have an end goal in mind. So therefore, their honesty may not be as consistent as it should be, given the fact that they never received correction or redirection when they were exaggerating or even lying. Imagine this individual then going into an environment that has more discipline, more structure, more feedback. All of a sudden, the individual is no longer, trying to talk their way in and out of something, but they are understanding that it's not about giving a lot of reasons, but giving the right reason, the right one reason overall. So this is how our foundation preferences are influenced by our environment. So unlike personality and behaviors, which I think change pretty quickly and pretty often, values and strengths are a lot more stable. However, over time, given the person's environment, values and strengths can evolve to some degree. And that's why I would emphasize here it is influenced by nature and nurture. It's consistent, but not stable, can evolve over time. And it really gets to character, morals, beliefs, such as honesty, hope, bravery, etc. It can be developed, but every person have a different starting point, let's say, as it relates to what ends up being their strengths, what ends up being their values. Last part here that I will mention, which I think is the most powerful one, and when I think about the business world, the least utilized. I have a psychology background and have the opportunity to do quite a bit of coaching and might slide into counseling type of conversations. And I've noticed that the business world tends to stay at the personality, behavior, and value strength level, and are very hesitant to go deeper into temperament / emotional needs / cognitive ability spaces, even though I think this is where the most power really is, to understand the person so you can properly place them, so you can inspire them, motivate them, leverage their strengths, and sort of natural characteristics best. So let's talk a little bit about this space. So I would describe this space as nature's imprint, the stable self. This space is not about improving, it's about understanding so that you could apply and meet needs in the best, healthiest way. So when you're thinking about your desire for approval, that would be an example of a temperament, emotional need that we all have. Some of us have a really high need for approval. Some of us have a lower need for approval, but across every person, we all have some level of desire for approval. What is differentiated is the intensity of that desire, which then ends up influencing behavior. So if I'm able to understand where I am on that continuum of my desire for approval, as a manager, or my manager would be able to know how much public and or private affirmation, praise, recognition is really necessary for me, beyond what I'm telling him or her. Because in our culture, as we try to portray humility, we sometimes say things that aren't really true. Like, I don't care about recognition. I don't want recognition. But in reality, you really do want it. You just want it to be authentic. You don't want it to be, someone just saying it in passing, but for it to be really meaningful. So you cover yourself. That personality, that behavior highlights it. But if you would give someone a temperament assessment, identify their need and degree of approval to some level of accuracy, you're then able to have a more open, authentic conversation. That person is able to really be vulnerable and admit their want and desire, and you can work together in order to really create the most motivating environment for that individual. And there's a list of dozens and dozens of different emotional needs that we have that could be identified with assessment, which I'll show you in a moment. One last point here before I talk about the cognitive ability is temperament is not behaviors. So let's take the example of the desire for approval. If I have a very high desire for approval and my colleague also has a very high desire for approval, those needs might be met in totally different ways. So as a result, our behaviors might be opposite, might be differentiated. So therefore, it's important to understand that temperament can never, ever be assessed by sight. It has to be an assessment, because only an assessment is indirect enough and scientifically proven enough to be able to get around all of the mask and the learned behaviors, etc., into what is the very core, because you don't know what an individual is really giving you. So it's very hard to draw based on observation what an individual's temperament really is. You can obviously get very far by asking someone like what motivates you, but I would prefer the complement of asking and having that dialogue plus having the assessment, so that if someone is, perhaps shy to really share their desire for praise, that you'll be able to at least say, well, this assessment, kind of says that you have a pretty high need for praise. What's the truth? And you could have a very open and more vulnerable conversation in that sense. And then the other part, which I think is underutilized, is the cognitive ability piece. And this is underutilized because most of the research says that the #1 predictor of success, of predicting success on the job, is someone's cognitive ability. And cognitive ability is not about gaining knowledge. It's about the capabilities of us to understand spatial skills, or to have spatial skills, for us to have reasoning skills, for us to be able to comprehend and summarize large amounts of data. And the reason why this is different than just the accumulation of knowledge is because every situation is unique and different. And what cognitive ability helps us understand is our capacity to be able to think at particular levels. So take spatial skills, and take your trunk, and take your upcoming summer vacation. And the fact that you probably have different items that you're packing into your trunk every single year. So the fact that you were successful in 2019, in 2020, in your summer vacation, packing your trunk, will have very little to do with your success packing that same trunk in 2021, because your car might be different, so the size of the trunk is different, and certainly the items that you put are going to have different sizes and weights and dimensions. So assessing someone's spatial skills is a cognitive ability that is foundational to the person. It's not something that you necessarily improved or can be improved, because the context and the scenario will always be different. Think about comprehension. You might have one paragraph, you do a wonderful job. You might have another paragraph. The fact that you did a wonderful job on analyzing and summarizing the first paragraph has very little, if nothing, to do with the second paragraph, because the information is different. You have to use your cognitive ability once again. So reasoning, etc., are cognitively based competencies of ours that the more we're able to understand it, the more likely we're able to know what our strengths really are, where we might need some help and some tools to help us be more efficient and effective in our daily work in decisions. So that's a lot there, but overall, look at this as a framework to understand an individual. So Patrick, if you want to move on to the next slide. So once you contextually understand the individual, you then have the opportunity to identify your preferred assessment in order to assess that particular criteria of a person. So using the model that I just shared, and this is just one of dozens and dozens of examples that you can have, is on the left-hand side, you have the self-selected, nature, nurture, influence, and nature's imprint, the stable self that we just discussed. You have this human components that we discussed, and then you have a recommendation for a specific tool that could help you assess that aspect of a person. So the interaction styles profile is a self-scored paper-based assessment that takes 15 to 20 minutes to complete. There's 56 questions, I believe, and you self-score it, and you have an outcome in 4 different quadrants that I think do a wonderful job at a very surface level to understand some preferences of individuals as it relates to their behaviors. Along that same realm is the characteristic of personality. Now, there's probably going to be lots of debate on where personality falls. I see personality as a self-selected, above the water type of characteristics. Other psychologists, other individuals might have a different opinion. Nevertheless, I think the Myers-Briggs does an excellent job of understanding personality in a simple, non-threatening, and understandable type of way. And in our work environment, this is what we care most about. Are we helping individuals to understand themselves better? I think these tool assessments are simple, yet effective in assessing the criteria of behaviors and personality effectively that is consistently well received by participants. And what's best is, and I should have highlighted this before, is assessments is really just the starting point of the conversation. It is not the conclusion. So based on having the assessment, that's when you get to build trainings and conversations that allow for there to be deeper understanding, ownership, and then eventually application from an action moving forward standpoint. From a nature, nurture, influence standpoint, strengths, I think we're pretty well familiar with Strengths Finder. And I particularly like for values, the VIA survey of character strengths. Strengths Finder has 34 strengths in rank order, 1 through 34. You can purchase all, or you can purchase the top 5. I think the top 5 is really almost all you need to help a really good conversation for personal development, as well as to help a new team, come together, or an existing team be able to work best together. The VIA survey of character strengths has 24 values ranked in a very similar fashion as strengths 1 through 24, and there's different options for reports. Typically it's beneficial to have the full report of the order of all 24 values, because it's good to dig deep into all 24 values as I have found it, whereas typically focusing on the top 5 strengths is what's almost only needed. And then at the very core for cognitive ability, I would recommend the Watson-Glacier critical thinking appraisal. It's comprehensive in helping assess comprehension and reasoning and spatial skills and patterns and drawing conclusions quickly, because timing is also a characteristic of cognitive ability, the faster you're able to come to decisions, typically the higher cognitive ability an individual has. And the Watson-Glaser has consistently and scientifically been very accurate and very precise in outcomes. And then for temperament, above and beyond my favorite and really the only assessment that I would recommend for temperament is the FIRO B, stands for the Fundamental Interpersonal Relations Orientation / Behaviors. This, I think, is the most genius assessment that is out there to assess what I think is the most elusive and difficult aspect of a person to really understand. And ultimately, what we're hoping to do with assessments is be able to predict something, to be able to put ourselves into the future of how this person will react in a situation, how much pressure and stress or what level of motivation is really needed. How would this team react based on the makeup of the people that make up the team? And if you keep sort of mushrooming that larger and larger, you can really get a good understanding of what your organization will be like from a personality characteristic standpoint, based on the makeup of its people overall. So to help you organize this, we have a handout which I'll ask Patrick to kind of slide in right now, just to show you before I show you some questions that could help you reflect on it. So given the assessments selected for this particular framework, what we're doing here is we're giving ourselves space in order to jot down the results of the individual and eventually have a reflection and eventual dialogue to really try to understand that person most. So if you're looking at personality and behaviors, the MBTI has 4 types. You write those right in. The interpersonal interaction style profile has a blend. Whether you're action oriented or you're a relator, you're dominant or you're analytical. You go a layer beneath, you can highlight here the top 5 strengths for the VIA survey and for the Strengths Finder. And if you go a quick layer below then, you have temperament here on the left. The FIRO B includes 3 overall areas: inclusion, control, and affection, assessed in 2 ways: express, wanted. And simply define, our express means you are you act toward getting that need met, and wanted is you hope someone initiates so that then you could meet that particular need. It sounds kind of complex eventually, but once you understand this concept and this pattern, it becomes a very powerful tool. And then you have the Watson-Glaser, which has the 3 characteristics of recognize assumptions, evaluation of arguments, and drawing conclusions. So if we would give someone all of these assessments, we're really going to have a nice picture of that person. And if you scroll down just a little bit, you're giving yourself an opportunity here, or the participant is able to give themselves an opportunity to summarize, based on the information on the report, what they see. And you're going to find consistency, and you're also going to find apparent contradictions. I think the consistencies give affirmation to, this is a real reality for that person. And where you see conflict, I tend to want to trust both assessments that came to different conclusions and really explore when. When is this true? When is this not true? So that you're able to then build plans, build actions that are pertinent and relevant, because we're not always wanting something. We're not always doing something. There is variation in the wants and needs and characteristics that we demonstrate. And as you continue to kind of move a little bit lower here, You just have some questions. What will this individual likely excel in doing? What struggles can you anticipate? How would you describe this individual's work style? Are they more task oriented or people oriented? And it's rarely ever binary. It's usually some gray and some blend, but at least you get to understand where a person's starting point is in terms of their pace, their collaborative, independent nature. Are they analytical or are they intuitive? Are they optimistic or realistic in their communication, in their mindset, et cetera? And you can really come up with your own questions as well, but I think this serves, either for the participant or for a coach or mentor or evaluator, depending if this is being used for selection or development overall. And the last thing I'll mention is if a group is going through these battery of assessments, there's the potential to aggregate scores and be able to describe the group as an individual entity, as an identity in and within themselves, to see where the blends are strongest in. And I think this could be very helpful to understand what type of team you need to build. So I'm thinking about the many, what I would call sprint projects that go on in an organization. So here's a high visibility, very intense, very important, high impact, cross-functional team that is put together, is a collaborative, gather our input, super analytical, very relationship oriented group. The best if you have a month to get a large complex project done, or it's a group characterized by assertiveness, by intuition, by big picture thinking, by willingness to take risk and being innovative, might be the better blend of characteristics that come together to be most helpful and most successful within that particular project. So that's how these individual assessments can really bubble up to help inform real decisions that we make. Thank you, Patrick, for sliding that in there. If you want to go to the next slide. These are just some questions that could be used from a coaching standpoint, specifically. Many times assessments are used in emerging leader programs and hyper programs, in one-on-one coaching, mentoring, where we really want the individual to walk away with understanding that leads to actions to help self-development and improvement overall. And to make sure that we get time for questions, we can kind of breeze through the last couple of slides, as they're just contextual in terms of application. And I highlighted this a little bit at the beginning of our call, which is where's the application, selection, development. Let's look at those as the big buckets, and then within that we have succession planning, coaching, motivating others, team building, new leader simulations. You leveraging and using the framework that we just talked about could be applicable to all of these areas. I'll go to the next slide. This is to just help you consider what's the purpose and what's the connection that's trying to be made with and through the assessment. Am I looking for a person job fit? So working with sales organizations, there's different types of approaches to sales, quote unquote hunter, that individual who's out there trying to drum up new business, versus the quote unquote farmer, the one who's really trying to continue and extend and really expand a relationship. Two different types of profiles are most successful in those two different types of roles. So therefore, what you're looking for in the assessment, or maybe even the type of assessment that you use, will be influenced by this. The person organizational fit, the person group fit, or the person supervisor fit. And what I mean by that is from a parent relationship standpoint, there are many times when, there are a lot of peers that need to be divided up to be led by particular leaders. Perhaps you're going to have clashing personalities, clashing or overlapping strengths that will either be beneficial or perhaps be a source of conflict overall. So the assessments can really provide insights on that. On to the next and final aspect here. And this is hopefully what you're able to get away from our conversation, is that there's not one assessment that allows you to have the full picture and deep understanding. It really is a battery of. And I know budgets are often tight and limited. However, as IO psychologist and as a proponent of taking at least an initial scientific approach to what is really an art when it comes to putting the right team together, motivating, developing, etc. Identifying proper assessments that are relevant to the criteria that you're trying to really build and understand becomes highly valuable. So the advantage that an organization can get from having a robust assessment process is really a springboard advantage than trying to guess or trying to assume. And still, the research says when it comes to selection, we go by intuition and we go by what we think or what we see in their personality. When it comes to development, we tend to focus a lot on their deficit, what's wrong with them, what they don't do well, and we don't spend enough time on what they do well. And I think assessments tend to do a good job if we're looking properly to identify what are the good characteristics, what are the valuable assets and strengths and skills that this person really brings to the table to be able to pronounce and emphasize those overall. So I would certainly encourage for the foundation of an organization to have a robust individual assessment process.
Okay, so Alberto, we did have some questions come in. So, well, first question, how do you get people that have different personality styles or strengths to collaborate?
That's a great question. I think number one, I think it's a conversation for self-awareness. Maybe the greatest benefit of individual assessments, if applied properly, is the increase of self-awareness that an individual will have about themselves, coming from an objective source, the assessment. I think building on the foundation of clear self-awareness and understanding, you can then have some conversations about what the strengths are, what the preferences are of the team members, of the co-workers that you are, that is engaging. And that could be in a one-on-one coaching initially type of way to kind of paint the picture of, what other people are good and strong in. But ultimately, I think having conversations between the individuals that might be in conflict based on these foundational agreements could really be beneficial. I'm thinking right now of a relationship that I'm working with, where there's a leader who is very independent and another leader who has a lot of organizational understanding and the desire to blend their skills together. One is highly independent, works on their own. The other has a great understanding of the organization is very collaborative and could help bring the person who's 100 miles an hour down to like 50 miles an hour, which will increase his effectiveness tremendously. And we're using assessments in order to understand one works at a warp speed and the other is more relationship oriented, which the one that works at a warp speed could really benefit of. So the last point here is trying to inform the individual of the benefits of changing, adapting, re-emphasizing, slowing down, whatever that might be, so that they see the ultimate value of adapting their particular approach.
Okay, good. Next question. How do you align individuals' assets with the organizational's strategic goals?
It's a great question. I think the first part is who makes up the organizational strategic goals. I really value the appreciative inquiry approach to change management and to strategic thinking and big picture thinking. So the more we could involve the organization, and I mean from the very top to the very bottom, the more natural buy-in you will get from individuals across the organization. Because ultimately, yes, we want our ideas to be applied, but it's rather satisfactory for us to be heard, for us to be understood, for us to be given an opportunity. I just saw a really interesting webinar that highlighted how does an organization get happy people? And one of the highlights that they shared, and they shared 3 of them, was, and I'll share the 3. The first is trust and respect. The second was listening, but the third was fairness. So the perception of fairness is key to motivate people in the workplace. So when an organization desires to listen, desires to seek input and feedback from many aspects of the organization for that big picture strategic goal, I think fitting in the individual's contributions to that becomes much easier, because it in some ways becomes our discussed vision, not just here's my vision and here's how I'm telling you to be a part of this. So the involvement in the dialogue and the conversation within the organization becomes critical to help fit individuals. And then the last thing I mentioned is we as human beings, we're pretty adaptable. It's pretty amazing how COVID has really, been, such an obstacle, such a challenge for all of us individually and collectively, but yet we are still adapting and finding ways. I'm just thinking about us here at Kent State being able to transition so quickly to deliver these webinars, deliver, consultative services. So individuals very adaptive. When there's clarity on vision, on strategy, and how I fit to that, we can take our skills and abilities and apply them in the best way possible.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Should different assessments be used for new hires versus those that are being considered for promotions?
Good question. I would say this. I think that there are some strong assessments for selection. So for example, or let me say it this way, I think there are assessments that have selection in mind. And I think there are assessments that have development in mind. So to me, I really use the Hogan for development. I use the Hogan for selection. I say the Hogan because it's a pretty popular assessment. I think the Hogan and the quote unquote derailers or dark side of personality, the HDS, is particularly strong in helping to identify strengths/pitfalls of an individual and very helpful in the selection process. I don't think it's as valuable in development because it's overly complex. There's way too many competencies. It's very difficult to narrow it down. The report is like 100 pages long if you take, the battery of assessments. So that's my starting point, is see if that assessment's geared towards selection and or development. And then from a development standpoint, I think culture plays a very important role here. And dividing between the emotional relationship aspect and the soft skills. So what assessments help me understand what type of communicator I am, my capacity for empathy, my capacity to ask questions and be in some level patient. So when it comes to development, I tend to want to focus on assessments that are really good at the softer relationship, emotional side, because it's an underused, undervalued aspect of the business world where we care about characteristics such as like, tell me your outcomes, tell me how analytical you are, tell me what systems and processes you have, and maybe take away a little bit from the softer, how sensitive relationship oriented pieces.
Okay, good. Well, that does conclude our time together. We would like to thank all of you for attending and encourage you to register for our upcoming programs. You can see some of the upcoming programs there on your screen. All of our fall 2020 and also spring 2021 programs will be delivered live and virtually via Zoom and are open for registration right now at www.kent.edu/yourtrainingpartner. To learn more about these and all of our other programs, I encourage you to contact us at 330-672-3416 or at yourtrainingpartner@kent.edu. We can also bring all of our programs to your organization and tailor them to fit your needs. You can join our extensive list of clients and bring Kent State to your organization. We will be taking a break from our webinars until after the holidays. Our next webinar will be on Friday, January 15th, 2021, when Christine Zuss will be presenting on how to engage adult learners. For those of you attending live, you will be asked to complete a short survey. Please complete this survey so that we can be assured that we are bringing you the most usable and relevant content possible. You will also receive a follow-up email early next week with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of Kent State Center for Corporate and Professional Development and our facilitator, Alberto Arroyo, thank you for attending today and have a great weekend.